It was a quiet evening in the protagonist's room. The soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the window, casting a warm light across the room. Everything was peaceful. The bed was neatly made, and the desk was cluttered with half-finished work. The protagonist had just finished their day, and after hours of focusing on tasks, it felt good to finally relax. They leaned back in the chair, taking a deep breath, letting the stillness of the room wash over them. But the peace didn't last long. A soft, faint sound reached their ears, barely noticeable at first. It sounded like a light tap at the door, followed by a strange creaking noise. They froze. It wasn't the usual sound of the door moving, not the creak they were used to hearing when the wind passed through the cracks. This was something else, something far more deliberate. Curiosity tugged at them, but they stayed seated, unsure of whether they had heard it right. Another tap, a little louder this time, followed by the door inching open just slightly. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. They stood up, slowly, instinctively, and walked toward the door. With each step, the tension in the room seemed to grow, as though something was about to happen, something they hadn't anticipated. When they reached the door, their hand hovered just above the handle. The tapping had stopped, but the strange creaking continued. The room seemed unnaturally still. No sounds from outside, no footsteps, no cars passing by, just complete silence. For a moment, they hesitated. What if it was a mistake? Maybe it was just the wind, or someone in the hallway, a neighbor who had knocked by accident. But as soon as they opened the door, they knew. Standing in the doorway was someone, or something, they had never seen before. A figure with skin that glowed a pale blue stood before them. She wasn't tall, but her presence was undeniable, filling the space as though she belonged there, though everything about her seemed so out of place. Her eyes, large and round, shimmered with an almost otherworldly light. They were the color of a deep ocean, but there was something more to them, something unsettling in their intensity. Her ears were slightly pointed, reminiscent of an elf, but more elongated, adding to her alien appearance. The delicate features of her face seemed too perfect, too symmetrical, as though she had been sculpted by an artist who understood beauty in ways human eyes could never comprehend. She didn't say a word, just stood there, quietly observing the room, as if taking in every detail, her gaze shifting from one object to the next. Her clothes were an unusual mix of styles, both futuristic and ancient, as if from another time, or another world altogether. The fabric shimmered with a faint, iridescent sheen, catching the light in a way that made it look like it was alive. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. They tried to speak, but the words didn't come. Their mind was spinning. Who was she? Why was she here? The questions ran through their head faster than they could process. But before they could open their mouth to ask, the door behind them creaked again, and they instinctively stepped aside. She walked in, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. There was no apology, no sign of fear or concern. She simply entered the room, her soft steps barely making a sound on the floor. The protagonist remained frozen, watching her every move, feeling a strange mix of confusion and awe. Her presence was magnetic, pulling their attention with an intensity they couldn't explain. As she moved deeper into the room, her gaze shifted to a framed photo on the wall. She tilted her head slightly, inspecting it as though it held some kind of deeper meaning. The protagonist watched, completely still, unable to process what was happening. What was going on? They couldn't help but wonder, why was she in their room? What did she want? But she didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge them in any way. Instead, she continued her exploration, her movements fluid and deliberate, like someone who had been here before, like someone who had always belonged in this room. The protagonist's heart was racing now, each thump seeming to echo through the silence of the room. Sweat began to bead on their forehead, and their thoughts were a blur. This was real, wasn't it? She wasn't some figment of imagination or a dream. She was standing right there, in their room, without any explanation. Finally, the silence broke. It wasn't from her words, but from the sharp intake of breath the protagonist took as they finally managed to move. They stepped forward, cautiously, still trying to make sense of the situation. "Who are you?" they finally managed to ask, their voice shaky and unsure. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes still focused on the objects in the room. But after a long pause, she turned to face the protagonist, her expression unreadable. The words she spoke next would change everything. But that, as they would soon realize, was only the beginning. The room was thick with silence. The only sound that could be heard was the faint hum of the air conditioning, but even that felt distant and irrelevant compared to the weight of the moment. The protagonist stood motionless, watching the figure of the woman as she moved around the room with an eerie sense of purpose. It was as though she was studying every detail, every object, with an intense curiosity that seemed beyond human understanding. She walked with slow, deliberate steps, her gaze scanning the space with an intensity that made the protagonist uneasy. Her large, glowing eyes seemed to absorb everything they saw, from the photographs on the walls to the small items cluttered on the desk. She didn't touch anything, not at first. But her eyes lingered on the objects, and it was as if each one held a secret, a meaning that only she could comprehend. Her presence was overpowering, and the protagonist found themselves holding their breath, afraid that even the slightest movement might disturb this strange, silent encounter. The protagonist tried to speak again, but the words caught in their throat. They couldn't bring themselves to break the silence. The woman, however, remained calm, unfazed by the tension in the room. She didn't seem to care that the protagonist was standing there, frozen, trying to understand what was happening. She wasn't aggressive or threatening, just curious. It was as if she didn't need to explain herself because she already knew everything she needed to know. The protagonist took a hesitant step forward, trying to make sense of the situation. "What do you want?" they finally managed to ask, their voice barely above a whisper. But the woman didn't respond. She didn't even glance in their direction. She simply continued her exploration of the room, her movements fluid and graceful. It was almost as if she was testing the protagonist, seeing how they would react to her silent presence. The protagonist felt like they were standing on the edge of something unknown, something vast and unexplainable. The air in the room grew heavier with each passing second, and yet there was no aggression in her demeanor. There was only an unsettling calm, a quiet that felt almost unnatural. As the woman moved towards the desk, the protagonist felt a strange pull, an urge to approach her, to ask her more questions. But something held them back, fear, confusion, or perhaps something else entirely. They had no idea who or what this woman was, or why she had come. She was an enigma, a puzzle they couldn't begin to solve. She paused by the desk, her hand hovering over a small stack of papers. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to touch them, but she didn't. Instead, she simply stared at the papers, her eyes tracing the shapes and lines on the pages, as though she were deciphering a hidden code. The protagonist watched her, fascinated by how she studied everything around her with such intensity. The silence was almost unbearable now, the tension thick in the air. The protagonist couldn't help but wonder if this silence was intentional. Was she waiting for them to say something more? Or was she simply content to observe, to remain a mysterious, silent figure in their room? After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally moved again. This time, she walked over to the window, her steps light and fluid, like a dancer moving across the floor. She stood by the window for a long time, her back turned to the protagonist, her face illuminated by the dim light coming from outside. The world beyond the window was dark, the shadows of the evening stretching out into the unknown. The protagonist couldn't take it anymore. They had to know more, had to understand what was happening. They stepped forward, their voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The woman turned slowly, her large eyes locking onto theirs. There was no fear in her gaze, no malice. Instead, there was a deep, unsettling calm, a knowing that sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. She looked at them as though she had been waiting for this moment, as though she had always known that they would ask. But instead of speaking, she merely nodded, almost as if to acknowledge the question. Her gaze shifted back to the room, and for the first time, the protagonist noticed something new in her eyes. Curiosity, mixed with something else, something deeper. Was it sadness, or maybe understanding? It was hard to tell. For a moment, the protagonist was paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. Should they press for more answers, or should they just wait and see what would happen next? The woman's silence had left them with more questions than answers, and yet they felt strangely compelled to stay in this strange moment with her. Then, as suddenly as she had entered, the woman began to move again, this time walking slowly towards the door. She didn't say anything. She didn't even look back at the protagonist. She simply walked, each step deliberate and measured, until she reached the door. She stopped just before leaving, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she was going to speak. But instead, she turned her head slightly, her glowing eyes catching the light just enough to reveal something almost imperceptible, a fleeting emotion, an unreadable expression. And then, without a word, she stepped out into the hallway, leaving the protagonist standing in stunned silence. The door closed behind her, and the room was once again left in stillness. But the silence felt different now. The protagonist was no longer alone in the room, not in the same way. The encounter had changed something deep within them. They stood there for a moment, trying to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The protagonist stood frozen in the middle of the room. The door now softly closed behind the strange woman. The silence was deafening, like a heavy blanket that had been thrown over everything. The atmosphere was thick with unanswered questions, yet the protagonist could feel a strange sense of calm settling over them. The encounter had shifted something deep within them, as if the very fabric of their understanding had been torn and something new was beginning to unfold. For a moment, the protagonist was unsure whether to move, whether to follow her or remain where they were. Their mind raced. Who was she? Why did she come? What did she know that I don't? Each thought collided with the next, until finally, they couldn't stand it anymore. They needed answers. With a deep breath, they walked to the door and opened it, stepping into the hallway. The air in the hallway felt cooler than inside the room, as though it carried with it some of the mystery that the woman had brought with her. But she was gone. There was no trace of her. No sound of footsteps, no sign of movement anywhere. The protagonist stepped further into the hallway, their heart pounding. Did she vanish? Was I imagining everything? Just as they were about to turn back, a soft voice echoed from behind them. It was not loud, but it was clear enough to send a shiver down their spine. "I know why you're confused," she said softly, her voice somehow familiar, yet distant. The protagonist spun around, heart racing. She stood there, in the hallway, as though she had never left. Her eyes met theirs, and this time, there was something different in them, a knowing look, something profound and unsettling. "You," the protagonist began, but they couldn't finish. Their words faltered, as though their mind couldn't keep up with what was happening. The woman smiled faintly, a hint of empathy in her expression. She stepped closer, her presence once again commanding the space around them. But this time, it didn't feel as unsettling. Instead, there was a strange comfort in it, like they were meant to be here, meant to witness this moment. "Why don't you sit?" she said, motioning towards a nearby chair. The invitation was calm, and the protagonist, although hesitant, found themselves obeying. They sat down, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes, in the last few hours. "I know you have questions," she continued, "but let me start by telling you this. I'm not from your world. I'm not from this time, or even this universe. I come from far beyond, from places you can't even imagine." Her words were clear, as if she was explaining the simplest thing, but the magnitude of what she said hit the protagonist like a wave. Who are you?" the protagonist finally managed to ask, their voice trembling. The woman took a step closer, her eyes soft but filled with an ancient wisdom that made the protagonist feel small in comparison. "I am an observer, someone sent to watch, to understand, to learn about your species. You are not the first human I have observed, and you won't be the last. But there is something different about you, something important." The protagonist's mind raced. Important. Me? The words didn't make sense, yet they felt oddly true, as if a part of them recognized it even if they didn't understand it fully. "Why me?" the protagonist whispered. "What do you want with me?" The woman's expression softened even more. She took a deep breath, as though gathering the right words. "You have a choice ahead of you, a choice that could change everything for you, for your world, for all of humanity. But it is not a choice that comes lightly." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The protagonist could barely breathe, trying to make sense of the weight of what was being said. "What kind of choice?" they asked, their voice barely audible. "You'll understand soon enough," she replied. "But first, you need to know that there is more to this world than what you see. The things you've been taught, the things you've always believed. Most of it is a lie, a distraction. There are forces beyond your comprehension, forces that shape your reality, but they are not of your world." The protagonist felt the room spinning. A lie, a distraction. What could she possibly mean? The woman stepped back, her eyes never leaving theirs. "I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to offer you something that could bring your species to a place you've never been, far beyond what you are now. But it comes with a cost. It always does." The words felt like they were coming from another realm, from a world that was too vast and too complex for the protagonist to understand. Their mind was overwhelmed, trying to keep up, trying to make sense of what this woman was telling them. "Is this some kind of test?" the protagonist asked, struggling to keep their voice steady. The woman's gaze softened. "No, it's not a test. It's a revelation, but only you can decide if you want to embrace it." For the first time since she entered the room, the protagonist felt a strange sense of clarity. There was a moment of understanding, as if they were beginning to see the threads of something greater, something more intricate than they had ever imagined. "You're asking me to trust you?" the protagonist asked, their voice shaky but resolute. "To believe in something that I can't even see." The woman smiled, and there was a warmth in her expression that made the protagonist feel less afraid, less unsure. Trust is a difficult thing, but sometimes it's the only thing we have. You may not understand everything now, but I promise you, when the time comes, you will. You will see things you can't even imagine. The protagonist stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Could this be real? Could she really be telling the truth? With a final, lingering look, the woman turned to leave, her presence still lingering in the air. "You'll know when the time is right," she said, her voice barely a whisper before she stepped out of the room, leaving the protagonist alone with their thoughts. The protagonist sat still, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on them. The room, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign, almost alien. What had she meant by the choice she had mentioned? What did all this mean for their future? The silence that followed her departure was suffocating, and the protagonist found themselves trapped in a storm of thoughts, wondering if everything they knew had just been turned upside down. They had been given a glimpse into something larger, something beyond the limits of their understanding. There was no denying that the encounter with the woman had changed them. But what now? What could they do with the knowledge they had been given? The protagonist felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. Time was ticking, and yet they couldn't even grasp what the true choice was. It was then that something strange began to happen. The air in the room seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, a tingling sensation that started in their fingertips and spread through their body. The protagonist stood up, the sudden feeling of unease making them instinctively glance around. The room looked the same, yet something was off. A strange humming noise filled the air, and the room seemed to grow warmer. The protagonist's heart raced as they looked towards the window, half expecting the woman to appear again. But there was no sign of her. Instead, a soft light began to emanate from the walls, faint at first, like a distant glow. "What is happening?" the protagonist whispered to themselves, but the question remained unanswered. Suddenly, there was a loud crackling sound, and a strange, swirling pattern appeared in the air before them, almost like a rift opening. The protagonist gasped, stepping back as the space in front of them distorted. Shapes and colors began to emerge from the rift, bending and shifting in a way that defied all logic. For a brief moment, the protagonist thought they had lost their mind. This couldn't be real, could it? But before they could react, a voice, familiar yet distant, rang out from the rift. "It is time." The protagonist froze. The voice belonged to the woman, but this time, it wasn't just a simple whisper. It was a powerful, resonant tone that seemed to come from all around them. Their heart pounded as the room seemed to stretch and warp, the space around them bending like a dream. "What's happening?" they demanded, their voice shaky. "This is it," the voice replied. "The moment you've been waiting for." Before the protagonist could speak again, the swirling rift expanded, pulling them toward it. Panic surged within them, and they stumbled backwards, desperate to break free from whatever force was drawing them in. But it was no use. The pull was too strong. The walls around them seemed to collapse into the swirling vortex, and in a split second, they were gone, sucked into the light. The world around them blurred and shifted. For a few moments, it was as though they were falling through space, through endless layers of color and light, too fast to comprehend. There was no up or down, no sense of time, only an overwhelming feeling of motion. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. The protagonist opened their eyes, gasping for breath. They were no longer in their room. They were standing in the middle of a vast, open landscape, an alien world, unlike anything they had ever seen. The sky above them was a deep purple, streaked with swirls of gold and blue. Towering mountains stretched into the horizon, their peaks lost in a swirling mist. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the ground beneath their feet was soft, almost as if it were made of some kind of organic material. Everything was different. "Where am I?" the protagonist whispered, taking a cautious step forward. Their voice sounded foreign, almost as if it didn't belong in this place. "This is the beginning," the woman's voice answered, as though she were standing right beside them. But the protagonist looked around and saw no one. "You've crossed into another reality. This is where the choice begins." The protagonist's heart raced as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. They had always thought the world was what it appeared to be, a place of rules, limitations, and boundaries. But now it was all shattering around them. There was more to existence than they could ever have imagined. "The choice," the protagonist repeated, their voice trembling. "What is it?" The woman's voice grew softer, but there was a strength in it. "The choice is whether to remain in your world, a place bound by limitations and rules, or to embrace the unknown, to join something far greater than yourself, to be part of a collective, a force that transcends your understanding of reality." The protagonist swallowed, their minds spinning with confusion. "What do you mean? What is this force?" "This," the voice said, "is the beginning of an evolution, a new phase of existence where humanity can transcend its limits. The choice is yours, to embrace this new world or return to your own and live the way you always have." The protagonist stood in silence, looking out across the alien landscape, their mind racing. This was no longer about curiosity or fear. This was about change, real, unimaginable change. What was it that made them hesitate? The life they had known, the familiar comforts, or was it the fear of the unknown that held them back? "You've seen what your world is capable of," the woman's voice continued. Now you must decide whether you will be part of something greater or remain where you are. The future of humanity depends on the choices made by those like you. The protagonist's heart began to slow, a sense of clarity starting to emerge through the chaos. They realized that they had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to step beyond their world and into something far greater. With a deep breath, they took a step forward, looking toward the horizon. The landscape before them was full of mysteries and wonders, but they were no longer afraid. The future was unclear, but for the first time in their life, the protagonist felt ready to embrace it. The woman's voice, now full of warmth and approval, echoed softly in their mind. "You've chosen well." And in that moment, they knew. The choice had been made. It was a new beginning.